the Governance Committee to order. Today, we will start with a roll call, and I am going to go ahead and share my screen so that those at home can see the agenda for the meeting. I think sometimes it's important for everyone to know exactly what we're discussing if they haven't had a chance to see it. So, Councilor Lombardi?
Here.
Councilor Tabor?
Here.
And I am Councilor Cook, and I am here as well. The first item on our agenda is to review and approve the minutes from the April 24th, 2023 meeting. Did everyone have a chance to review those minutes?
Yes.
Can I get a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Any comments or questions?
It's good.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The minutes are approved. Then we move on to old business. The first item on our agenda is the administrative ordinance, and I think it's really important to note that at this point we've discussed several options for what to do with the administrative ordinance, which we were looking at for quite some time around ways to make sure that we have appropriately staggered terms on our committees. And then there were some language updates to the administrative ordinance. There were several options presented for ways to rebalance terms, but there are challenges around that, and that's what the committee has discussed in the past. This is just an update for those at home who haven't tuned in to governance in the past. And we were at a stage where we thought we can ask certain committees to make that decision themselves on how they want to rebalance terms within their committees. On others, we can ask them to rebalance the terms. But when it comes to quasi-judicial boards that are approved by RSAs, there is legal standing at the state that limits the actions of this committee and the council when it comes to rebalancing terms. And one of the remedies that was recommended as an option was going to the state courts from the legal team, because that has happened in the past with other municipalities. So that is a possible remedy. However, if you're going to go to the state courts, that means that you're asking for a legal remedy. And there are potential legal pitfalls in that. And so I asked the legal counsel how we should handle that and how we should handle discussions around that without impacting, negatively impacting that process should we decide to proceed with that recommendation to the council. The recommendation I received back is that we could have a brief non-public session just to discuss potential pitfalls with legal counsel with that kind of recommendation, and that's why I put non-public, potential non-public here on our agenda. I wanted to ask you both how you feel about that before we proceed with a non-public session, but noting that we probably shouldn't discuss that option without consulting with legal counsel. So
I'm fine with that.
Yeah, in other words, if we're going to approach the courts, we need to know the risks. And we don't want to necessarily talk publicly about those risks, because that would jeopardize our position.
yes, you wouldn't want to be in a position that somebody, that you open up the city to any kind of scrutiny around a recommendation like this. And you want to know what are the potential legal pitfalls of doing this. So that was the concern. If it is reasonable to everyone here, I'm happy to have that non-public discussion here in this meeting or to have it at the next meeting, either way.
I could make a motion to go into non-public if you'd like.
Yeah. I guess my only question, I know we have a lot of legal strength here, but should Susan be part of that as well?
I guess that's a question for legal counsel.
I think she would be fine if we simply provide, shared with her what our thinking is on that. And if she feels she needs to further weigh in, I'm sure she will let us know, and we could respect that. So I think it's really up to you if you're ready to have that conversation now. I guess, is Bob aware that this conversation might happen today? Because
I did not, no.
Okay.
Although there's a lot that can be discussed perhaps in public, and
Right.
I think the dividing line is sort of general versus specific. And I think you can discuss general things, how board members get appointed, what role courts have and these kind of things. Those could be discussed in public. And
Okay.
just have that discussion. But specifics, anything about any particular case, particular person, anything specific, then I think you should probably not have that.
Right.
in which case you could tee that up for the next meeting, put it at the bottom of the agenda,
Okay.
so that you finish all your public business first. And that would allow us then the opportunity to see if Susan wants to kind of weigh in, or at least be part of the initial conversation.
And I should note that arose out of a conversation that I had with our legal counsel, with Susan. So, and that the suggestion did come out of that discussion. That is important to note, that I had been consulting with her directly on this issue. So we can discuss, though, the generalities around this process. And what I've been told is that you basically you can ask the courts to take action to rebalance appointments when you have an uneven stagger. So,
I think dividing line between what gets done in court and what gets done everywhere else, like at the city council or at the state legislature, is that the court is where you go to resolve disputes. Disputes in particular land use cases, for example, get resolved in court. If there is a dispute between anyone, government officials, citizens, property owners, or anything else that related to an appointment of a member, or the constitution of the board, or anything that's a dispute, that can get resolved in court. That's really why there are courts. And but what I think is not available is just bring some law to a court to change it. If the court says this is who's on the zoning board, this is how planning board members get appointed, this is the mayor's authority, those kind of things, the court will not change those things for you unless it's in the unless it's in the context of resolving a dispute. So if there is some dispute in the city about membership on the planning board, the zoning board, the HDC, anything like that, it's very likely that dispute can get resolved in court one way or another. But if it's not a dispute, it's just a matter of some element of the government or somebody outside the government wants to change the composition of a planning board, zoning board, HDC, anybody else. You really can't do that by going to court. You have to have some kind of a dispute between somebody.
Right.
So, if I may, if we make a plan to adjust the terms of appointments, and then someone challenges that, then that would go to court.
That very, very likely, yeah.
the other question I have is, there's a dispute between our ordinance and state law on this. Can you bring the challenge between our ordinance and the state law, which our ordinance says, limits the number of appointments per year, and says that we're supposed to have a healthy stagger? Can we bring that challenge?
that is the kind of dispute that could end up in court for sure.
Okay. Okay. Because I think that is the concern of the committee, is that we have a lot of people rotating off at exactly the same time, which means you lose considerable expertise at the same time, which you don't want to do, especially on land use committees or boards. Right?
But if our ordinance disagrees with the RSA's, don't the RSA's take precedence automatically?
Well, if they truly disagree, then what the court would do is determine what the RSA required and tell us to follow it.
But not every state law preempts local law. So that's the issue of, the space for dispute sometimes.
Very common for a state law, for example, to say that members of a local land use board will be appointed in accordance with the policies, practice, and
There you go.
procedures of the local government.
There's a
body.
carve-out for the local.
So in that case, you would not have a dispute.
It's also my understanding, I think, that our ordinances were in place before the state law. Especially, I think, zoning and planning ordinances were in place before state law.
This relates to an ongoing issue concerning the planning board, in which our ordinance differs, our ordinance as currently written differs from the state statute as currently written. But over probably more than a year now, dealing with this issue, the position that the city is taking is developed by Attorney Peter Laughlin, who literally wrote the book about municipal law, and his position in writing numerous times stated publicly is that the current city planning board appointment ordinance was consistent with state law at the time it was drafted and adopted, and it has not been changed since it was valid. Therefore, it is still valid. If it changes, he wrote, it would have to change to become in conformance with state law as it reads now.
Okay.
And that's the issue in a nutshell.
So that
Careful
begs
what we
the
wish for.
question. Sorry, did I? That begs the question of, do we in fact prefer our local ordinance over the state law?
Well, it's even more refined than that. Our view, based upon Attorney Laughlin's writing, is that our current ordinance is the valid law of the city.
Right.
Not whether we prefer it, we believe it's the valid law of the city right now. And now if it could be changed, city council would change it or not, as it were.
Right. But if we were to open this discussion and go to the courts for assistance in changing anything that would likely lead to altering potentially our ordinance in general.
Yes, it could be changed. It could, that issue could end up in court, and it could result in whatever the court determined was the appropriate result.
Okay.
But our goal remains, if I can, to get a healthy stagger in the terms. And we're out of sync with that at the moment. And we've looked at a couple of different remedies for that within the world we know of mayoral appointments. So I think for those people who are affected by this, I think we should keep our goal clearly in mind. To just have a healthy stagger, to have a certain amount of ongoing expertise on the land use boards.
So before we leave, if we're going to leave that topic before, here, I would like to say this, I think, to support. This city administration and the city staff, they have a role to play in these things, and the city council has a role to play in these things, and they are different roles. The council is the policy-making body. Council adopts the laws, the local laws, the ordinances. Once the council has made a policy-making decision and has adopted a local law and ordinance, then the role of the city manager and the city staff becomes to implement the law that's been adopted by the council. So, if we have an ordinance valid in place that says, here's how planning board members are appointed, and the city council has adopted that ordinance and hasn't changed it, then it is the duty of the city manager, the city legal department, the planning department, and everybody else to take that valid ordinance, valid until shown otherwise, and follow it and comply with it. And that is exactly what has happened thus far to date with regard to the planning board.
I think some of the challenges, though, are on other boards, too, like the HDC, where we had a huge number of appointments last year to the HDC, which means that the stagger is off with the HDC, and we need to be careful of that because you could lose considerable expertise all at once. And it also is kind of unfair to each mayor if one mayor gets a lot of appointments to one land use board and another doesn't, just because of where the stagger falls. I think the goal is, and the goal in the ordinance is pretty clear that you're only supposed to have a certain number of appointments per year, with the hope that each mayor has an even number of appointments over the course of their term, which we're not following. And that's part of our current ordinance that we're not following. So, and I think, and we've discussed this quite a bit in the past, and that's, I think, the concern is finding ways to best address that, without doing anything that puts us in a legal jeopardy around these issues. Yeah.
So I assume you could do that with a policy, but then policies are much easier to change and adjust, much easier than an ordinance. So what we really want is something to continue the process throughout, from term to term.
And there's also the question of timing of appointments too, which is something else that we have discussed here, which is something that I talked with legal counsel Morel about, is moving the appointments back. So essentially all current members end up with 3 additional months. Apparently, there are some legal challenges around that as well, because you're changing the terms, even if you're extending the terms. And that remedy may have to go to court as well. So, so these are, I think this is where I had, serious questions then and thought we really need to bring it back to the committee so that we could discuss it. Because if we can't, adjust terms and try to make it work, and the only remedy truly is to go to the court and ask the court to rebalance. The end result of that is that the city has no say or control in that process and what the court decides. So the court could come back and change say your ordinance is out of compliance and it needs to be brought up to date. The court could, rebalance the terms and, regardless of when appointed too. So you don't know how that's going to work. So I would say that there are a lot of challenges around this.
Yeah, if I could, Madam Chairman, would it make sense? I'm feeling the need as a committee member to know what the state statute says versus our ordinance. So maybe some kind of memo explaining that. And,
May I
or
say-
even a verbal, just a verbal, you could just outline it to
Could I
us.
ask Councilor Tabor a question here? Do you mean with regard to any one particular board, or?
Well, I think we've got statute on ZBA and statute on planning
HDC.
and HDC. So what does the state say we should do versus what do our ordinance?
Sure.
Where do we differ?
We
Or
could-
that could be verbal too, but I'm feeling that need to understand, like, as I recall, we have differing end dates, one's December 31st, another's January 1st, things like that.
And the HDC at one point had June as an ending too. I don't know if they still do.
It is one of the dates for HDC appointments. But the dates are not always clear now because when people filled terms, some of the appointment dates moved.
Right.
So for the reasons that Councilor Cook has said numerous times, I think it is generally perceived that it is an advantage for all the city boards, commissions, agencies, committees, everybody, to have the staggered, primarily to maintain a continuity of knowledge and experience. We've talked about this a number of times, and the big problem, I think, is that it's a separate ordinance, and in some instances statutes, some instances not statutes, for every one of those. So it becomes kind of a big job to write in a stagger for everybody doing everything in the whole city government. Now, in an effort to try and simplify the work and achieve the same result, an idea that we've talked about in the past is that since virtually every appointment follows the process of appointed by the mayor, approved by the city council, maybe there will be some way that just by amending that one little process as it applies to everything, then you would not have to go through all the state laws, all the ordinances, change everything to create this stagger that's desired, because you could create an ordinance that required the mayor in making these appointments to do it every time for everybody. And that way, by changing one thing, you would change everything and just be a lot simpler, a lot easier, get the exact same result.
Right.
And we talked about it a little in the past, not actually written anything.
Yeah, we had some language on that.
Had language.
Yeah.
So that would be a separate ordinance from the individual ordinances that
Yeah, that was the thing.
create the,
That was the thing, something like that.
And we had that language written in, but I think I had some other questions that were raised around that.
Yeah, I don't have it anywhere in my file. I don't.
And I'm sure he wrote it too, actually.
It's not here.
I have it. So, but yeah, so maybe this is something that we should come back to.
Sure, because
Yeah.
at our next
And
meeting.
maybe our homework should be to read the state statutes and read our own ordinances
I mean,
with a yellow pad and figure out,
the clock is running here. We got to get going on these things.
Right. I'm happy to send around the state ordinances because I have them all. I've gone through them quite extensively, and that's where I identified the challenges in the first place, so I'm happy to share them. I will send them through the legal department and ask them to send them out, what the current state ordinance is. I should note that the state ordinance was very different when we wrote our ordinance. So this clearly does not currently apply. So if there are conflicts, note that we're not under the current state ordinance completely. So, very important.
Would it
I mean,
be helpful to, within those ordinances, to have you highlight where the conflicts are? I mean, or
I think it's
do
going
we
to
have to
be,
discover them ourselves?
I think
or-
it's going to be really obvious where the
Okay.
conflicts are. So, yes.
so just today, we had a legal intern start.
Guess what?
We already had a list of items for her to work on. But what I think I am hearing, so let's concentrate on the land use boards, because I know we've already fixed the cemetery committee stagger.
Yep.
We've got sustainability's coming up with a rewrite, because I think there were some stagger issues there. I don't know where parking, traffic, and safety is, but I
I've
think
asked
they're working.
them to look at it.
So some of those some of our local committees, the stagger issues are getting corrected simply because there are updates that are being made to other portions of that ordinance anyways to fix missions and stuff like that. So I think what I'm hearing is you're looking really at the land use boards as the real conundrum of how to tackle that. So let's take HDC, for example. So you've got, I think you're looking for the HDC membership ordinance, that section. And then as you're reading across, here's the local authority under this city's ordinance of how that membership happens. Then you have what we actually have in terms of however it happened that there's no stagger, whether it's because it's in the local ordinance or because something just, didn't unfold over time the way maybe it was anticipated. So that you could just see, okay, where is the rub? And that might lead to what is the remedy? And maybe we just take one board at a time. Given, like, if we just started with the HDC and see if that kind of format of laying it out helps lead us to what, if anything, we want to do to try and fix it. That's kind of what I'm hearing you're looking at. Am I wrong?
EDC.
Well, I know one thing that's caused a lot of the problems is that when there's a vacancy,
right?
the vacancy sometimes gets filled by a person who serves a full term.
Full term.
And the vacancy sometimes gets filled by a person who serves the remainder of the departing person's term, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of consistency in how the decision gets made.
Yes. That's exactly been our challenge over time, and that's why
Yes.
we're off stagger.
Yeah.
And so the goal would be to fix the stagger either through shortened appointments, which I've been told is not possible, or through some other remedy over time around appointments, or asking the court to fix the terms. And then being very consistent about how people are appointed around terms, making sure that,
Yeah.
that if somebody leaves early, you're only filling the end of a term
Right.
versus getting a full appointment. And so I think that's the goal. But I'm happy to address them one at a time. I do think that we should bring in our
Susan?
legal counsel
Yeah.
to speak with us, so that we understand exactly all of our options. We can talk about all of them except what it would look like actually being in court around this case and asking the courts. And so I think it's important for us to know what that remedy looks like, even if we don't recommend it.
Yeah, I agree.
So that's where I had landed at this point. So maybe we bring her in at our next meeting to talk with us. And then if she can attend, and if we have to, we might have to move our meeting to make sure that we can get her on our schedule. And our next meeting is scheduled for June 12th, is that right? We'll go over that at the end of the meeting. But we will make sure that we bring her in so that we can discuss all of our options. Because I don't want this committee to make a decision around this and make a recommendation to the council and then define that that is not really a reasonable option for this
Yeah.
committee. So,
And I'm glad we kept the discussion in public, and it sounds like if we do go non-public, it would only be narrowly around what if we had to go to court to change the stagger in some way.
Exactly. And it's not just, discussing the option of going to court. It's discussing what are the pitfalls of a potential case before,
Right.
legal pitfalls specifically is the questions.
Right.
Beyond that, I think everything else can be discussed very much in public.
Yeah.
So, and if this committee then decides not to pursue that option, we can easily then unseal those minutes and share them.
Right.
Yeah. So,
I just have a point of order. Did John made a motion? Is that correct?
I said I was willing to make a
Okay,
motion.
all right. I just want to make sure that we didn't leave that hanging.
No.
Not according to my
Okay.
little minutes here.
Okay.
okay, good. So then let's move on to conflict of interest, which was the bulk of our discussion at our last meeting, and where we stand right now. I've asked legal counsel Sullivan to be here to share with us his thoughts. He was working on draft language for us following our discussion at our last meeting. Specifically, we had asked to look at a potential preamble, and we had also asked around some other questions about appropriate roles for the council in front of other committees when you can speak, not speak. We asked for some discussion around that, and for him to consider just general draft language for how we can alter this conflict of interest section, 1.802, which is now being shared on the Zoom and on the screen.
Yeah, I have a ton of notes here. About different ideas. But none of it's really in the form of a new ordinance yet. Maybe we could start through some of this right now. What I had thought was the governance committee would want to look at each section of the existing code of ethics, determine whether that's something you want to keep or something you want to change, and then you would look outside of the existing code of ethics to think about the new things you might want to include. And I have all kinds of notes headed in that direction. A great many of them come from conversations that I've had with Councilor Cook and some of my own.
I can also offer up that if you look at the minutes from the last meeting, it kind of summarizes the issues that you had previously identified, and the committee wanted to ruminate further on. So what I have is, you had some discussion about a preamble and creating a definition section.
And I have language for those. They talked about definition of the term family,
Yep.
definition of the private interest versus public interest and use.
Yep.
And,
And then there was, the committee discussed possible amendments to section D, where Counselor Cook was leaning towards a prohibition from a city councilor or other elected officials from speaking to a matter before a land use or other board unless that counselor has a direct interest. But there was some conversation as to whether that would be something that the other counselors would support as a direction, and the committee members were going to reflect further for the next meeting, which would be this meeting. So that might be a good to know whether Attorney Sullivan will be drafting on that, or where the committee's going to land on that, because I know there was a good discussion last time about the pros and cons of moving in that direction, and
Yeah.
First Amendment issues, I know we talked about a little bit, and so that's certainly one that,
these basic ethical standards have probably not been changed in 40 years or more. So there certainly could stand some room for improvement. And it's just a question of, the governance committee has to say, here's the improvements we want to recommend to the city council. And once you do that, exact language to accomplish that.
So, do we want to discuss the preamble language that Council Sullivan is starting to draft?
So my recollection is Councilor Tabor had a preamble language that,
Yes,
Yeah.
that I sent to you, I believe.
it was from Concord, I think. It was some
Yes,
nice broad statement of how everybody ought to be ethical.
Yeah.
well, yeah, I mean, what's the reason for the ordinance? And the language was, the citizens of Portsmouth are entitled to a fair, ethical, and accountable city government. The effective functioning of democratic government requires that all of its officials, whether elected or appointed, comply with both the letter and the spirit of the laws and be independent, impartial, and fair in their judgment and actions. Public office is to be used for the public good, not for personal gains. Public deliberations and processes must be conducted in an atmosphere of respect and civility and openly unless legally confidential. To this end, the City Council adopts this code of ethics for all of its officers and officials, whether elected or appointed. So, gives the purpose, gives who it covers, gives the crux of the definition of personal gain versus public purpose.
You know, you have a nice living case in point in the news this week about ethics. The United States Attorney at Commonwealth of Massachusetts got caught up in a sufficiently bad ethical situation that she was compelled to resign. And if you look at the actual things that she did, they tend to be kind of small things, really. But in that position, United States Attorney, with ethical obligations to the entire government, the small things added up. And I mean, she took 2 Celtics tickets that were intended for others. She used her position in office as United States Attorney to try to attempt the result of a local election in Massachusetts, and in which a district attorney in Suffolk County was being selected. No federal involvement really at all. She's a United States Attorney, but she got involved in that local election in a way they used the federal power to try to weight the dice. So and what reminded me of it was, it kind of fits exactly what you just said, what
Right.
Councilor Tabor just said.
Yeah.
Yeah, fits my concern too about section B, about representing interests before land use boards, bringing the power of the council and pressure of the council into that environment when they're supposed to be making independent decisions, quasi-judicial decisions.
You know, the average person comes home at night after working all day, you know, trying to feed the family and everything else. The average person, average citizen, average resident voter is not going to delve deeply into the operation of the city government that day. Just can't. But what is important is that average person at least has a feeling that the people in City Hall are decent, honest, trying to do a good job. And, you know, that's something that needs to be accomplished by a code of ethics. We got to help those people at home at night feel like the people in City Hall are decent, honest, and doing a good job. So that's why they need to be ethical, why they need ethical standards that apply in a broad, general way like the Concord ones.
Yeah, and it helps draw the clear line, you know. Covered a case in newspaper days where the police chief in a small town would ask if he could take the bags from the parking meters to the bank. And he would do that regularly, about once or twice a week. Well, they served a search warrant on his home, and they found bags of quarters that he'd been skimming. And because he started wearing very nice clothes all of a sudden. So, you know, it's the using of the office for, it's very easy to cross that line and use the authority of the office. And
I think that's a very overt example. I think that, I think we talked about, you know, representing yourself as if you're an elected official and trying to represent an interest to a land use board, it's very difficult to do that and not feel like it's not right. But on the same token, and we had this discussion about, well, if you're in a butter, maybe you do have a right.
Right.
But it, you know, I don't know. It's, where's the line?
yeah, I mean, we've talked about this, but in the case of an elected counselor taking up a public cause before the land use boards, by definition, the counselor has a voice in who's appointed on that board. I mean, the mayor appoints, but all those have to be discussed and approved by the council. I thought our existing ordinance was pretty good about that, because it says that the elected person can't appear on behalf of private interests before any governing body or land use board of which that officer is a member, or which is subject to approval by that elected official. So I think that would appear to me to cover it.
I think that the nuance there is whether you're I think when that, as I read that, kind of my lawyer hat, it's like, oh, I'm going to help my neighbor by speaking specifically on behalf of my neighbor, versus I have a view in terms of some element of the proposal that is before the land use board that is bigger and broader and not specific to that, representing the individual interest. You may not know John Jones, the abutter to a particular proposal. And I think that's where I'm sort of hearing the kind of, is this language that we have enough, or is it not enough because it doesn't fully capture what I'm hearing some people have concerns about in terms of public statements in front of the land use boards, depending on one's capacity. So just, I agree, this covers a lot, but it doesn't cover the spectrum.
Right.
Just to put it all on the table very clearly so that we can get direction and know which way. I'd like to assign Mr. Sullivan to do drafting.
Well, you have to balance that with,
What's gone wrong with my life?
an elected official is still a citizen and still has citizens' rights.
Yeah,
When we first started talking about this, the first thing I pointed out, this is really difficult stuff.
yeah.
And it is really difficult stuff, and this is the perfect illustration of it right this second.
I know that I'm probably a little stricter on this rule. I mean, I've seen, the idea is that this precludes speaking before land use on personal or private interest. That even when it's not an abutter's interest, when it's a personal viewpoint. And I would personally think the language precluded that. But that has not been the practice. So when you look at language and you think the language says one thing, but the practice is not following that language, then you know that you need to alter the language to fit what you think is actually being implied here in this language. So that is my concern, is that in past practice, people have felt free to speak before land use boards on just views that they have, which does create that conflict. And even if we think the language precludes it, it's still happening, and there's some gray there. I think that should be cleared in the same way that I think that we should take the ethics instructions for land use boards and codify them into our conflict of interest section, because we give them instructions, but those instructions are nowhere in our ethics code around what they should and shouldn't be doing. But without having that in our ethics code, it's not really clear to everyone that is, if you violate certain conflicts that are laid out for you in your training, that you are committing an ethics violation. So I think that's it's a vice versa situation. The council, in my mind, the council shouldn't be politically trying to influence decisions made in land use boards beyond the power to appoint at the council, not speaking to. And vice versa, the land use board shouldn't be speaking to land use items, which I think they're instructed not to do, outside of their committee. So I think it goes both ways here, because we have to protect the quasi-judicial nature of those boards. So I think that's important.
So if I get it, just as I'm taking my notes here, you're suggesting that one option would be to develop a specific section speaking directly to those sitting in a quasi-judicial capacity, or when they are sitting, I should say, when they are sitting in a quasi-judicial capacity,
Yes,
then the following applies.
correct.
Because there may be other boards occasionally that sit in a quasi-judicial capacity.
Correct. And our land use boards sometimes deal with items that are not quasi-judicial when they're dealing
Or
with
legislative.
changes in zoning ordinance, for example, that's not quasi-judicial. So in that case, it doesn't apply. So,
Am I seeing nodding? Like, should I indicate concurrence? You want to talk about it? Just so that, I just want to get clear direction, because I'm,
I guess,
or do you want to keep talking about it?
I guess I want to hear it again, just what is being said.
You want to?
us, again, yes. So I think it's important to clarify the role of the council here in section B around our role in, or lack thereof, in speaking to quasi-judicial boards on issues that do not involve a direct abutter interest as being, creating a conflict of interest. Even, and that our only role there is in appointments at the council around quasi-judicial boards, beyond speaking to our individual abutter interests. And vice versa, that we need to make sure we codify the instructions for quasi-judicial boards around when they can speak and not speak as well on issues.
To other boards.
To other boards.
Yeah, okay.
To other, in the community, there's very specific rules they're given, and I don't sit on one of those boards, so I don't know exactly what those rules are, but we should codify those rules as well, so that it's really clear what the rules are back and forth.
Okay.
That's what I think is important. I think it's also important for the public to see that there are differences here, because I think there's a lot of confusion in the community around the different roles of different bodies in the city government, who makes those decisions around developments in the city, or around, there's a lot of thought that that's a council decision, when actually that goes to planning and zoning on appeal. So I think it's important for people to understand, this is this role, this is this role. These don't cross. Here are their very specific instructions for how they do interact or don't interact.
Yeah, and I think it's important because if a member of the governing body goes to a land use board and gives their opinion, are they speaking as a citizen, or are they speaking as, we are policymakers and this is how we feel from a policy perspective? I think that's confusing to the land use board.
Yeah, but you can't go in and state, I'm a citizen, I'm speaking. I'm a policymaker, I'm speaking. I mean, you're both, no matter where you are.
That is one of the challenges that I've always thought is a problem. We also, at the council level, it's very interesting, at the council level, and this is another piece that we should probably talk about, we allow counselors to step down and speak at the podium in their personal capacity, not as a counselor. I also question that practice to
I've
some
only
degree.
seen that once, actually. myself.
Yeah, but it is allowed. So the question is, is there such a thing as being able to speak in your personal capacity? Or speaking in your personal capacity at public comment, does that carry more weight than your average resident who's speaking during public comment? So in effect, you're not really speaking in your personal capacity.
No. Yeah.
So I have questions around that practice as well. So this concept of speaking in personal capacity versus private interest is personal capacity, private interest versus public interest is very, very challenging, I think. Because you don't lose your
Right.
personal interest, but at the same time, in agreeing to serve, you take on a different role and a different responsibility. I think even in the council or on any of our boards or committees, that in some ways you do cede some of your individual rights to speak because you've elected to do so. You've elected to take that role.
Well, does that give our attorneys grist for some language?
Well, let's talk about that grit for a second, because we got to get organized and get moving here. And here's what I have in my file as issues kind of being worked on in one stage or another of drafting. We have arts and culture, an arts and cultural committee. And we have a lot of writing on that, but no completed writing. Ethics, we have a ton of notes and discussions on ethics, including definitions of the term family and what are private interests that you might not want city officials representing before public city agencies. But again, we don't really have any final work product yet on ethics, and it looks to me like it's a long way to go before there's going to be one. There's just so much ground to cover. Economic development, there's some consideration of changing economic development, and we have a pretty close to completed ordinance on that one, I think. It's virtually ready to go. One or two words to talk about. And then we have this whole issue of the staggering of boards and commissions generally, which we talked about a lot, but don't really have anything to forward to the city council yet. That's not how to approach it. So that's what I have in my little file right here. You may have more. Suzanne might have more. But that's what I got, and it's a lot. And we gotta start trying to pull this thing together pretty quick, or else the summer's gonna be over.
Yeah.
So do you want for the next, I don't know if we can do it by the next meeting, like, when I think of these, at least the preamble, some definitions, these couple of items, would you like to see an actual draft, maybe for the next meeting, if we can turn it around in time? Even if it's not everything, but at least begin to give you some concrete language to say, yep, this works. No, we need to keep talking about that. Does that sound like where you want to go?
I think
Yeah.
that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Councilor Cook about her reservations about members of the governing body talking to land use boards.
So maybe we'll draft something, and then you can, in the, looking at a actual language, then if you need to have more conversation about it, then
Okay.
I'll give you all my notes, Bob.
Yeah.
It'll be really easy.
Yeah, we definitely want them. It is time to, it's really time to start pulling this together.
So we will continue this discussion at our next meeting then, hopefully with some draft language. And I will be happy to help work on draft language as much as needed. And then let's go back and look at the next two items on our agenda, because I would like to get to the new business. New business is two of those draft ordinances that have come forward for us. And yes, we're anticipating more. We anticipate an arts and cultural, potentially arts and cultural commission ordinance as well, coming down the road, which is already being worked on.
So to help you all get going on that, let me discuss for a second Economic Development Commission,
Okay.
which I read, and because my concerns when I read these isn't so much the policy involved, that's more your business than mine, but what I look for is is the proposal consistent with the council manager form of government? So, for example, does it make sure that the people that are working for the city manager are still working for the city manager and not working for a volunteer committee, that kind of thing? So with those kind of thoughts of mine, I read through the proposal that we have from the Economic Development Commission, and I thought it was very close to ready to go. It's a pretty good job. And there's just one or two little things, and they were along those lines of what I said. The city council's the policy-making body for the city. The city manager is the administration of the city, and, just respecting those kind of things. Tiny stuff, and that Economic Development Commission ordinance, that could be ready to go, I think, in one discussion.
That's good.
I don't
Thank you, Tom Watson.
I don't remember. Is there any stagger issue with the EDC?
I think there is.
Yes, there is. There's a slight stagger issue with the EDC as well.
So I'm wondering if maybe what we do, this would be the time to correct that, because I don't see that addressed in here.
Right. Good point.
Can we handle that with appointment instructions to the mayor?
That's kind of what I'm thinking, similar to what we did with cemetery committee, maybe at the back end of it.
Yeah, that's the neatest, cleanest solution to everything if we can do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because we had that little paragraph, at the back end, when you adopt this, ordinance change, the mayor has the authority to, and then we're very clear, the next two appointments will be X terms, and then it goes back to the default of whatever I forget whether it's 2 or 3 years or whatever it is for EDC, but maybe it's just that little bit, so that really it's just the next two appointments or so are impacted.
Okay.
But we'll look at that, to add that in.
Okay. I was going to ask Councilor Lombardi to speak to this a little bit, because Councilor Lombardi sits on the EDC, so he has experience with the process around drafting that. And I should note, we will come back to the sustainability ordinance conversion in a minute.
Yeah, well, I mean, this was brought up, and I think, as I said in the council meeting, the request of help with the outdoor dining, turning that into an ordinance. The question arose about looking at their role, and when they looked at their role, as according to the ordinances that were written in, I believe, 91, it was that was written out of need for Pease closing, and so things have changed quite a bit since then, and they felt that it would be important to really define more specifically the kinds of things and the kinds of actions they could take, and they thought they could be helpful to other committees and commissions in helping with their roles and as an advisor. So that's where this came from specifically. And as I said, Tom Watson drafted this, who is almost a city attorney.
I'm not going to say it.
No, I know that. But I think he did a pretty good
He has a
job.
lot of time on his hands.
Yeah.
He's retired. I mean, he's really retired.
Yeah. But I think he did a good job,
He did a good job.
and I'm glad to hear that this proposal is, close to being what we need.
I thought it read well. The only thing I didn't see was one of the major reasons for economic development commissions is to go after grants. Well, we have community development block grants. I don't know if our economic development person is involved in those applications. And then there's Community Development Finance Authority, which a lot of cities and towns use because they'll pay for plans for things or financial feasibility analyses. So those, I think, are important components of the work.
Good.
My biggest questions around the draft are actually questions that I would have for the Chamber of Commerce executive in town. And the reason I say this is that I think we should always be incredibly careful in the city government that we're not duplicating any services that are provided in the community. And I want to make sure that the draft language does not infringe upon any work that's already being done by an outside entity. We should never be creating additional work for our committees. And so the committee should be achieving, in my mind, something that is not being done in the broader community. And so my question would be around how much of this are all of these tasks that we only do at the city level, or any of them tasks that are being done in the community, and rather than doing them, we would ask to serve as a coordinating role and coordinating with those entities that do this outside work.
Yeah, I would say Ben did review this. I would ask him, I can ask him if he give it another read with that in mind and just,
Otherwise, I thought it looked reasonable.
Yeah.
You know, if these tasks are not occurring, I want to make sure that they are occurring somewhere.
Since we got so far with that, let me give you my 2 comments, and I'll be actually done. Number 1, their number 10 was that the committee would provide leadership and guidance to assigned department heads and staff in the planning and economic development and redevelopment. And my only point there was the thing that I really started with. Staff works for the city manager.
Right.
So the language has got to be clear that the Economic Development Commission is not actually directing city staff. That's 2 words difference. And then the last one is the Economic Development Commission's recommendation was that recommend the city council approve proposed changes to administrative code. And my thought would be the recommendation should she bring in an ordinance for first reading.
where was it?
At the very bottom.
Okay, yeah. Right.
And with those 2 things, as far as I'm concerned, and in terms of any of the legal tests that would apply, this could come in right away.
But did I also hear, just to close the loop, make sure I've got it, that we might want to add some language in here that says, add language that the EDC would have a role to look for or support grant opportunities?
Yeah.
I leave it that simple. And then a provision at the end for the adoption to correct any stagger. And we'll kind of look at that more specifically.
Right. I mean, let's say everybody went nuts in Concord and said, we're going to create a fund for economic development for all our towns and cities, you know, to the tune of whatever, millions. Who would go after that for Portsmouth? I would assume it would be the EDC. And there's federal opportunities that we talked about.
I can just say that as a practical matter, most of our grant writing gets done in-house. Now, the exception recently has been the cemetery committee, because I had someone who was skilled enough to know and willing to do the application for the Moose Play grant. But then that does create we still have to sign off, we reviewed it, final signed. And then there's that administrative back-end paperwork. So it's a conversation.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
volunteers and staff have to work together on it.
And I think one of the other critical aspects of this, as far as looking for grant opportunities or having grant opportunities, is around funding for a lot of these tasks. Most of these tasks are not free. If it's, as simple as like a mailing that goes out to the community, or, conducting research, maybe, you might be hiring an outside firm to do that research. That's all financial in nature. And so if there is not funding for the EDC, which currently I don't believe they have a line item, beyond funding for tourism assistance that we receive as a city, they probably need to identify some funds to pay for some of this work, if it's not a line item in the city budget. And I think that's where we absolutely need to clarify the role of the committee around guidance for the assigned department head, whether or not that is our current assistant manager for economic development or whoever that may be, because we also don't want to assume that person's budget is going to automatically go to the EDC and the EDC's work. So.
I just wonder on that number 10, if it just provide leadership and guidance to the city manager for department heads.
I think that's an improvement.
Right, provide leadership and guidance to the city manager
For,
relative to planning of economic development and redevelopment. And I think with regard to the functions, it just says they may perform. So it's broad authority, but it doesn't mean that, depending on the needs or the direction from city council of different tasks that they would like the EDC to look at, I think there's always going to be that question of, do they have the resources already on the board to do that, or with staff support and how that gets accomplished? So I think it's okay to have broad functions as long as everyone understands it's not a requirement, and it will probably ebb and flow in terms of which functions get tapped at different times depending on the needs of the city.
That one's about ready to go.
So, from what I'm hearing, we want a little bit of language around grants.
Yep.
We want to make those changes to section 10 and to the summary statement at the bottom, maybe with instructions as well around appointments and how to fix the stagger here for EDC in this process. And we want to just check in and make sure that the language works with the Chamber of Commerce. We're not overlapping work there. Then I think it can come back to our next meeting for discussion at our next meeting, and potentially final approval to move it back to the council. Does that seem reasonable timeline?
yeah, I would just say that I don't think this last paragraph, recommendation and action requested, is not part of the ordinance. It's just, it's what they asked. They kind of asked me to get it going. And
Well, I commend the EDC on this work. This is a significant amount of work, and it's in really good condition coming to us. So thank you to the EDC for doing that. And we will go back now to the second ordinance, draft ordinance change that's coming to us today from the Sustainability Blue Ribbon Committee. I don't know if the legal counsel had an opportunity to look at this one very closely.
I did not. I don't have the sustainability ordinance yet.
I would say the legal department has not yet had a chance to weigh in carefully. I know I skimmed it, but we haven't had significant time to kind of look at it. Like I said, I had some thoughts initially, and so maybe any kind of broad thoughts or comments that this committee had, we can then kind of put the two together, and I don't know if we'll be able, given the other task, to bring it back for the next meeting, but maybe the meeting after. So we'll see.
Okay.
Depends on the workload, as you know.
Yes. So I'll ask the committee, did you have an opportunity to look at this one? And are there any questions around sustainability?
I did read it. It seemed to be a very good start. It seemed to have a sensible way to transition to a permanent committee. The number of members on it, the constitution of it, different representatives, and the goals I thought were good.
Yeah, I didn't read it in like my detail head. I read it generally, and I thought that it's a good draft.
I share those views that it's a reasonable draft. I do have questions around, while I sit on the Sustainability Committee, I was not part of the drafting of this process because I knew it was going to come to governance for a review. So I want to make sure that we were reviewing it carefully here at governance and with fresh eyes on this. So I wasn't present for the writing of this ordinance. So it would come here, and we would be looking at it through a governance perspective rather than through a membership perspective there. I have a question around this residency requirement that is at the top of the list. We talk about residency, eligibility for appointment to commissions and authorities, and that is our standard resident requirement that we have in our ordinance. But then they've added some language at the end of the residency requirement to try to allow for students who are currently serving on the Sustainability Committee and any future students that are part of the Eco Club at Portsmouth High School to allow them to sit on the Sustainability Committee, whether or not they're a City of Portsmouth resident, because they are in attendance at our high school and they're a member of the Eco Club. And the Eco Club chooses those individuals to send them to sustainability. So we don't appoint them at the council level necessarily. And I think that there maybe is a more elegant way to handle this rather than specifically singling them out in a residency requirement that leaves our residency requirement intact. My suggestion would be to just include members of the Eco Club as appointed, and they wouldn't be named members of the committee, but, whatever number of members of the Eco Club, 3 members, 4 members, whatever that ultimate determination is, as appointed by the Eco Club at the high school, would be represented on.
And full members.
And full members of this
Yeah,
committee.
I-
Right, so that they're representative of the Portsmouth Eco Club. They're not individuals that are appointed to the committee. And one of the advantages of that as well is that you have high schoolers, you don't want to get into a situation where you have a high school student who's appointed, who then graduates the next year, and so then that leaves a gap in your appointment schedule. And so somebody else fills that role, or a high school student who's on the committee or in Eco Club one year and then not the next year because they have too busy of a school schedule and they don't have time, so they drop off. I think you'll just see a lot of rotation around that at the high school, and I think it creates some inconsistency on the board unless you have just the representatives of the Eco Club rather than individual named members there. That would be my suggestion here.
And then we don't have to disturb the residency requirement, which I think is really important to a lot of members of the community.
So just to clarify, so basically you're creating well, positions for Eco Club members without regard to the specific individual filling that role. So the city council is not going to be approving appointments from the Eco Club onto the sustainability. It's just going to be that there will be a sitting representatives from the Eco Club on the committee. And it really is that Eco Club committee that will be determining who is sitting at the various meetings. So as long as we're all good with that. So it's an ex officio, but full voting membership.
I would say that we should include a number.
Yeah, I think there was a number. Was there a number? Two?
Well,
2, yeah.
two, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, currently they have between 3 and 4,
Yeah.
is what I would say. So you're going to start out with more at the initial appointment, and I think that that's well laid out here, that you're going to reappoint everyone who's sitting. But they are going to quickly phase out because of graduations. In fact, I think 2 we're losing on the Sustainability Committee this year because they're going off to college next year. So you're going to lose 2 automatically, and then you're going to only have 2 come back in all likelihood. So I think it's probably easy to handle that way. And the language here might be reasonable, and that's where I want legal counsel to look at it. You know, it might just be the designated students from the Portsmouth School District.
Right.
Might be enough language there. You might not even have to specify Eco Club in case they change the name of the club at some
Right.
point. But I just want to make sure that we, that it would work without that language under residency requirement, that we can retain that.
In the work that's been done so far on the Arts and Cultural Committee, that same concept of having organizations that are stakeholder organizations be involved in selecting the members of the committee, just like the Eco Club is.
Yep.
That concept is at play there as well.
Yeah.
So
Which
we may be
makes sense.
seeing this again.
Yep.
Right,
Mm-hmm,
right,
yeah.
right. I think it's valuable because you want Portsmouth High School students represented. They are members of our community. They're at our high school. Whether or not they live across the border in Greenland or in Newcastle, they're still members of our high school and our high school community. And at the high school, they're all treated the same. So it would be hard to say, oh, you can't send us your president of the Eco Club because they happen to be a resident of Newcastle, for example. So I think that would be probably unreasonable to tell the high school. And it would create a dichotomy at the high school that we don't want to create between students.
They have a lot of energy. Good to take advantage of it.
Boy, we saw that at when they were council.
Yeah.
Energy
Student
was
government.
amazing.
Yeah. So is everyone comfortable with, if I can get legal to kind of answer that question and make sure that this works
Yep.
on that without kind of touching
Yeah.
the residency, if we can avoid that? That would be fantastic.
Yep.
And,
Would we want to say up to 3 representatives? Because that's 2 now, right?
right, it is. I think that the challenge is that when you get down to 10, of the 10, do you want 3 students? And I think that was making sure the makeup is consistent, because right now we have 3 to 4 students, usually 3 show up consistently, of 18. So it's not as percentage-wise.
Yeah.
From my reading of it, that seemed to be the goal, is to keep the percentage in a similar vein as to what they have now
Okay.
of students. But this is one of those opportunities to involve students. One of the things that I counseled them on before they started drafting this is I told them that, there is nothing that precludes students from coming and participating as on the side with the discussions, because the culture in this committee, they would like to preserve the culture in this committee, and the culture is to include everyone in the discussion who is in the room. So, and nothing in the language here changes that culture for the committee. So there can always be more involved.
Right.
Yeah. In the discussion. So, everyone comfortable with that? Any other questions around this one before and hopefully we will be able to get language by our next meeting, no guarantees. Is that a reasonable assumption?
Well, Tom Watson and I are spending 10 days in the middle of June going to baseball games in Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Manitoba. We can guarantee you that we could have that Economic Development Commission thing done.
Okay. Okay. With that
I forgot you were
said,
doing that.
I think that if everyone's comfortable, let's move on to public comment. Is there anyone who wants to speak?
Thank you. Good morning. Paige Trace, 27 Hancock Street. First, as your comments pertain to the EDC, I would remind you all that it starts with state statute, and you have 3 other quasi-judicial boards: the ZBA, the Planning Board, and the HDC. And to suggest that now the EDC will advise in any way those 3 boards, however well-intended, 100% neutralizes and negates what you were discussing earlier, and that's that those boards should not be governed or advised by a sitting member of City Council acting as an individual. At least that's appears to be the feeling of this board. I do agree with the fact that it's difficult because we do have members of the HDC currently who do feel very strongly about their rights and the rights of the First Amendment, and quite regularly are expounding on public social media. And they do believe that is their God-given right. So you're suggesting that the HDC and the Planning Board are quasi-judicial, yet you're saying in the next breath that the EDC is going to advise them, and then in another breath you're turning around and you're saying, well, any government official cannot speak on their own right as per the First Amendment. So where are you going with this one? Leave the quasi-judicial boards alone. If anything, look to state statute, which trumps local. And if you have a question, then go to those HDC members and remind them that they are a volunteer. You like them very much. They're doing great work, but they don't need to be discussing this, as you say, outside of their purview. That's one thought. The next thought is, as a council, you seem to be spending, and as a committee, a governance committee, you seem to be spending an inordinate amount of time about every committee in this city. If it's not broken, don't fix it. And yet you spend no time on yourselves. You talk about going to state statute, and yet the first one that should be looked at is one that pertains to you all as a committee. And it is the RSA 91A right to know law that governs public meetings, non-public meetings. And until we get to the idea of what a quorum is and how valuable it is to understand what a quorum is, whether you like it or not, and I've sat with you, Commissioner Tabor, Counselor Tabor also, so you should know, of all people, what it is. The minute you have 5 people, one of you needs to walk away. It's that simple. No matter how you'd like to be together, one of you needs to walk away. And until you can understand that and how the state supersedes municipal, you have an issue with this council, at least with 6 of you. And I really would love to know, and also with the 3 of you here, you're the governance committee. And you, all 3 of you, sat through a quorum. And as defined by the state, a quorum is a meeting. It doesn't matter what you think it may be, or whether you want to try and say it was chance, which we all know it wasn't, because the first of you walked in and grabbed a table for 5. So it didn't go to the bar, grabbed a table. And those who saw it didn't ask for it. But it's really important when you have a governing body of this city who's an elected official. You all took an oath. It goes 24/7, as one of the 2 attorneys here would tell you, and did tell us quite regularly. You don't get time off for good behavior. You took the oath, and you work for the city residents. And I think that in the future, this needs to be addressed because it's really important. You work for the residents of this city. You don't work for the city manager, you work for the residents, and the city manager works for you. And so does the legal department. And Councillor Cook, with all due respect, you talk about wanting to save money for the city. You have 2 city attorneys here. One who has more years than I'm sure he'd like us to know. He's immensely wise. They both are. I would trust them with my life. But you seem to want to bring down yet a 3rd attorney. So we have $200,000 sitting here, and you want to bring another $160 or $70, $180,000 in. That's a lot of money when you don't need to do it. So I would advise you that state law and state statute trumps municipal. And while you're in looking at all the state statutes, maybe you want to bring in all of the RSAs and look at them for yourselves, because you were a quorum of a committee that night. All 3 of you were there. So, and you're the governance committee. We trust you, dear God. Where are we going with this one? You know, so please, in the future, how can we trust you as the governance committee? And Attorney Sullivan, I can't thank you enough for your time and the 2 years that you reminded us that never, ever were we to meet as a quorum, and never, ever did we meet as a quorum without a member of the city legal department, and that was once. And Attorney Sullivan, you were there, and it was by chance. So to all those out there who think that 5 of us met all the time as a quorum, no. On a stack of Bibles, no, it never happened. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Peter Huda, 280 South Street. The first thing I'd like to talk about, and I didn't get a chance last time on this, is your discussion about city councilors not speaking at any land use board meetings. And the upsetting thing to me about this is that this committee is forgetting why we have the land use boards and what their job is. Basically, they're supposed to put together and abide by the land use rules, the RSAs, both state and local. So it's a little upsetting when I'm sitting here listening to counselors say that, well, they're worried about getting reappointed next time based on what a decision they would make would be. So that totally goes against everything that they take an oath to put forward. Councilor Barta, you are on HDC. You have your rules. You bring in, a developer brings something in, you look at it against your rules. It should have nothing to do with whether a counselor speaks or not. If a counselor speaks, that's their opinion. And when a counselor comes up and says, I am speaking as a resident tonight, that should have some pull. Basically, what you're looking at doing here is taking away an individual's right to speak. And whether an individual speaks on a butter or they speak on something across town, if they see something that they feel strongly enough to come to that meeting and want to get their opinion out, I don't see how this committee, by putting it in the ordinance, can take that right away. And that's all I'll say about that. The next thing I want to talk to you about is this EDC ordinance. I thank Tom Watson for putting this together. I found a couple things in here that were a little, I guess, overreaching for this committee since you're creating a new ordinance. And the first thing on the powers and duties, basically, the first sentence, the committee shall develop and recommend to the city council, that's fine, and other departments, boards and committees. I think that's a little overstep. Of city policies, the only board in the city that can have anything to do with policies is the city council. The city council has to finalize the policies. For you to have the overstep here of the EDC having anything to say about other boards and committees or making any recommendations, I think is an overstep. You have policies in number 3 also. That's a little bit of an overstep. And it's the other thing that's a little concerning here is meet and confer with businesses, civic organizations, developers, educational institutions, landowners, and citizens to learn the resources and needs of the community. So as I completely agree with Councilor Cook on the separation here of public versus private, and what we're talking about is the city and taxpayer dollars being spent on something versus what the chamber and outside entities should be working on here. When you talk EDC, you're talking about, for example, doing research and everything. There has to be dollars in here to back this up, and those are taxpayer dollars. So my question is there, on this committee, is there a clear separation between what the city should be and could be providing versus what an outside entity such as the chamber could provide? So that's something for you to please think about on that. The other thing that was a little striking on this is that nowhere in any other committee or boards is a committee advising another committee, especially on the planning, zoning, and all of that other stuff. Basically, this really looks like the EDC is taking the role of more than just an advisory board here. They're going into talking about our land use boards. So that was very concerning on this. I guess the last thing I'd like to talk about is the, and this is basically a question, I really don't understand how this committee is going to call a non-public and what would be discussed in that non-public according to the RSAs. There's no financial responsibility here. There's nothing. You already have two attorneys sitting here, and I fail to see what needs to be discussed in private about this. And I would also take you back to the rules for a non-public meeting on this, and I would like you to cite which provision of the non-public meeting that you're going into a non-public on this would provide. So I thank you, and I hope you consider my statements. Thank you.
On Zoom, I think we have Richard Dependa. You can go ahead and unmute yourself on Zoom. There we go.
Hello,
Hello.
are we in the public comment session?
Yes, we are.
Okay, I'm Rich DiPantimo, 16 Dunham Way in Portsmouth. And I just wanted to make some comments. I know you all probably have seen some of my comments to the paper and so forth. I'm sorry, we had a little background noise. You saw my comments about the HDC committee and the issues relative to my concerns about a conflict of interest. And I'd like to respond to some of the comments that I've heard. First of all, this is not a First Amendment right. A member who is on a board or commission who has power over a public person who is making an application for a particular project on their home or in their neighborhood, that power is beyond the issues of First Amendment. If the member of the commission or HDC, for example, has has concerns as a public citizen, they have a right to make a statement, but they need to remove themselves from the committee, go to the public comment section and make a comment as a private citizen, not as a member of a commission or board, and then they must recuse themselves from that vote based on their bias that they've expressed in their comments. So they have a First Amendment right, but they do not have a First Amendment right to use their power to say things before, as a member of the board during the negotiations and discussions on a particular item that is before that board. That is a conflict of interest. The policy manual for the HDC specifically states that if an individual would not be allowed to be seated on a jury because of some comments or some conflict that they have, then they would not be allowed to sit on as a member of the HDC on a deliberation that's before them. And in this case, the individual probably would not be allowed to be sat on a jury in a court of law after having made the statements if he was dealing with an issue relative to solar energy. So the HDC policy manual specifically states that, and that individual should not have been able to vote on that issue because of his biased comments that he made prior and during the discussion on that particular application. As I said, this is not a First Amendment issue. The person still has their First Amendment rights to speak as a public citizen before the board, but they must remove themselves from that deliberation and speak as a private citizen, and then recuse themselves from the vote on that particular item. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that everyone? Public comment? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and close public comment. The only announcement today that I have for you is under the current committee schedule. I have on the schedule as our next meeting on June the 12th, followed by a meeting on June the 26th. I want to confer with committee and make sure that everyone has that on their schedule as well.
I'm sorry, I missed the second one.
June the 26th. So the 12th and then the 26th.
I may be out of town the 26th. I could attend by Zoom.
When is the, oh, let me see, 26. June 26. I have to look at my. Sorry, just getting a calendar.
So, want to make sure before we leave that we're all clear. I noted that Counselor Tabor is probably going to have to attend by Zoom on the 26th.
Okay.
I think
Yeah,
that-
I'm all right.
June 12th meeting, I'll be out of town as well.
Okay.
We'll see what we can get together before he escapes for baseball.
It doesn't mean I couldn't write stuff ahead of time.
Okay,
I'll do
okay.
whatever Susan tells me to
Right.
do.
As, you know, as always,
I feed him.
as always, I will count on the city manager to staff the committee in any way that she sees fit. So. Are we good on the 12th and the 26th? Okay. Okay. Are there any other announcements? Okay. With that, then can I request a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Any second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right. Thank you.